Okay, so I really wanted to insist. You can read Professor Rossini's bio, but I just want to say that I was always struck that a person with such a medical background, uh, an eminent neurologist, one of the most famous of his country and worldwide, uh, has such a grasp of two basic things. One is the importance and the correct use of methods to analyze the EEG. Second, why why neurophysiology, and in particular electroencephalography, really has to be transformed in order to have relevance for brain health. I met Professor Rossini the first time when he was president of the International Federation of Clinical Neurophysiology, and he was talking at a very early stage at multimodal imaging. I think he was one of the first of the traditional, let's say, crowd of clinical neurophysiology. So he was always in the front line. So it gives me great pleasure to have him. And I just want to mention that he is one of the members of the steering committee of the Global Brain Consortium. So please, Professor Rossini, we're waiting to hear you.
Dear Pedro and dear friends and colleagues, thank you very much. All the words very kind words that Pedro told you only mean that I am very old. So my presentation, as you heard, will be most from the side of a clinician and neurologist, and will be mainly historical. And in preparing it, I was really surprised myself on how many evolution the EEG had in 1 century. And I am sorry not to be able to survive 1 more century to see the next future, what will take us. So the history actually comes from a long track, starting with Gaton and Galvani, and it came back to the 24 of the last century, when Hans Berger was showing for the first time to be able to record the electrical activity of the cortex in animals, even if it took 5 more years to convince the scientific community that they were of biological origin and not just noise or artifacts. And actually, it was the intervention of Lord Adrian, the Nobel Prize Lord Adrian, that was in favor of the biological origin of such oscillations, to convince everybody that these were actually coming from the brain. In these early pioneering stages, Berger was defining first the definition of alpha and beta waves with some early important observations that, for example, that the alpha is blocked by the eye opening or is blocked by some mental activity. Gray Walter, some years later, was able to demonstrate the presence of slower activity, including delta and theta, and made an important contribution to introduce the very first methods of automatic analysis of the EEG activity. There was a technological evolution for sure, if we consider that a one-channel system, like is shown on the left, was occupying nearly the entire lab space, while today in a small box we can have many hundred channels of EEG recordings. But still in the clinical routine, we are using usually the 32-channel organization montage with the 1020 denomination of the different recording channels. All the silver chloride electrodes are still widely used, But today, for the large arrays of electrodes that are usually employed for research activity in humans, for example, the system of 128 or 256 channels, we can also use dry gel-free electrodes to make the montage faster and more feasible for any kind of experiment. Going to the clinical application, in the 30s and 40s, so few years later, after the demonstration that these were actually biological signals, it was demonstrated for the first time the biological origin of epilepsy, because we were still discussing whether epilepsy was coming from the device or from somewhere else, because there was not a real clear demonstration that there was a biological support to seizures. And it was shown the presence of spikes, like in this clear trace, with some phase reversal suggesting the place where the focus of the seizure was localized. The spike and wave patterns, which is an hallmark of absence of petit mal type of epilepsy, usually in children, and were also described for the first time the presence of focal slow waves localized or secondarily diffused. Consider that until relatively recent times, let's say the early 70s, the EEG was the only non-invasive method to demonstrate the presence of brain tumors and neoplasm because of this type of slow waves. Otherwise, you have to show it by pneumograms, which are extremely invasive, or by direct injection of contrast medium in the carotids for invasive angiography. Penfield in Montreal Neurological Institute was a pioneer for epilepsy surgery, but taking advantage of this direct approach, he was also producing a lot of nice papers on intraoperative electrocorticography, looking at differences of the EEG signals directly recorded from the cortex versus those recorded from the scalp, and showing the filtering procedures, the loss of high-frequency components, and many other changes that the EEG is going through when the signals go through the peri-brain involucres, including meninges, including the skull and the skin and muscles. In the years coming after the Second World War, the introduction of the first computer systems allowed to, for the first time, to average to a given stimulus the EEG signals, and to have for the first time the evoked potentials. That means that we can demonstrate the presence of oscillations of the brain activity, electrical brain activity, time locked to an external stimulus, either visual or acoustic or sensory, or even mental. So we got the visual evoked potentials, we got the somatosensory evoked potentials, we got the motor evoked potentials, on which I will spend a few words later on. And we got also the event-related potentials by considering as an event an internal process, mental process, including, for example, the identification and numbering of rare stimuli within a sequence of frequent stimuli, and producing a wave shape, which is called P300, because it is of a positive polarity and with an average latency of 300 milliseconds. You heard already a lot about the power spectral density analysis with all the possible pros and cons of this kind of fast Fourier approach, which is important for some clinical applications, especially in the ICU in patients with coma or vegetative stage, because it's easy to see, it's easy to interpret, and it's easy also for non-expert people to identify an increase of the alpha activity versus an increase of slower components. Coming to more recent days, connectivity has exploded. You already heard from Professor Pius a lot about it, much better than I can say. But it is important because the connectome is actually one of the most recent approaches to the brain function. It can be done with very nice and spectacular MRI procedures, which can make the anatomy of fibers smaller and smaller as the magnet and the system are becoming more powerful. But they cannot tell us very much about the functional meaning and the dynamics of such connections, which the EEG and magnetoencephalography can tell us. And finally, the entropy, which is another property of the brain signals, which can be very important in some human diseases, brain diseases. So the evoked potentials, you know very well the visual evoked potentials with the triple component of the occipital response, the auditory evoked potentials, mainly the brainstem. Again, the acoustic brainstem responses until 1975, when the CT scan was introduced worldwide, were the only functional approach to brainstem function. There were no other kind, except for the blink reflex. So these two neurophysiological approaches were given to the clinician an important information about the function of the brainstem in several pathologies, including multiple sclerosis, neoplasms, and so on. Somatosensory potentials very important in spinal cord and brain pathologies, and more recently, the motor evoked potentials in their two double components with peripheral registration of the motor responses and the EEG responses to direct transcranial stimulation, so-called transcranial evoked potentials, which provide also a direct information on connections. This is a short list and probably non-exhaustive list of possible clinical application of the different techniques that I was speaking about. And an important chapter should be reserved to the sleep studies. Because again, sleep was a dark side of the moon until the EEG came in. We know that the humans spend about 1/3 of their life in sleep, but we didn't know very well how the sleep was organized and how the brain activity was changing during these hours of apparent comatose state. And in California, the school of Nathaniel Kleitman was introducing the concept of polygraphy. That means the registration of EEG together many other biological signals, including the breath, including the EKG, including the pseudomotor response, and many other biological signals. And we are able to actually describe many stages of the sleep, showing that the sleep was a dynamic situation and not just a stable one. Was not just a switch off of something, of a trigger, but actually was producing a number of biological conditions, production of hormones, distractions of catabolites, production of good metabolites, and so on, which are vital for the human life, at the level that in the very rare cases of hereditary insomnia, this is really fatal. So the people cannot survive because they cannot sleep. And it was shown that the sleep is not the same during life. is quite different across the different ages of the humans. And it was shown that the different stages of the sleep, including the REM one, are changing in timing and amount across life. Monitoring is another clinical application extremely important, both for intraoperative and the intensive care unit monitoring. There is no time to enter in more deep detail, but no surgeon today is going to put the hands in places close to the brain which are fragile during some intervention or on the spinal cord without having a monitoring for legal problems and for ethical problems. This is just an example of changes of somatosensory potential during carotid clamping and an intervention of endarterectomy. At the beginning, we have the full signal before clamping, and you see the sudden flattening of the signal, and the signal is coming back when a shunt was introduced. So this kind of approach is life-saving because it inhibits the patient to wake up from the surgery being completely paralyzed. More recent, quite interesting, the possibility to record the EEG within the magnet of the fMRI, and also to trigger the acquisition of functional fMRI and then to study the both signals combined with EEG, for example, by synchronizing the acquisition of the analysis of both signal with some spikes in the signal of the EEG, and to demonstrate the presence actually of a network. So there are few small foci at the beginning, 4 seconds before the discharge of the polyspikes discharge, and then suddenly you see this kind of network which is actually sustaining the discharge. You can imagine how important is this approach for epilepsy surgery, because if you don't have this kind of information, you don't really know where to put your hand and where to cut or not. Connectivity, in my opinion, is the most important part of the history, the recent history of EEG. Why? Because the EEG mainly comes, as has been repeatedly said, from a synaptic activity, and because there are some human disease of the brain that mainly start with synaptopathy. So the very first step of this disease is a lack of function of the synapses. So the EEG, in theory, should be able to pick these stages very, very early. I really do not want to go through technical descriptions because I have not sufficient background and because others have said much better than me. But you know that today it is possible both at source level and scalp level study this functional connectivity. It is possible by using the graph theory to create a graph of the brain in which we have nodes and the path and edges and connections, and we can measure the localization of the nodes, the importance of the nodes, and the strength and length of the connections. So we may have all this important information both within the same hemisphere and across the hemisphere. We can be more and more detailed as we increase the number of recording electrodes on the scalp. And therefore, I think that this represents really an important future for our specialty. The graph theory moves from the idea that if we model the brain as a network, and if I put the nodes in the area of interest of the brain, for example, in a certain restricted areas which are empirically supporting a given function, I can analyze in time the behavior of this network organization during the performance of the task. And I can measure a number of parameters, including the path length, the clustering coefficient, the small world, the modularity, the global efficiency, and so on, and many others, as you have heard by Professor Pius. We are using it more and more in approaching the brain of demented people, in the idea, again, that dementia is a long-lasting process which is working in the darkness for probably decades. So the attack to the brain does not come a few months before the symptoms, but probably many, many years before. And the brain is able to resist, and because it has a number of resilience systems that we know very poorly and on which I think we should focus more. And the functional integration and the functional segregation, which is the network organization of this brain, is changing significantly during the pre-symptomatic stage of the disease. So we cannot do by EEG any etiological diagnosis. This is my opinion. We cannot distinguish between Alzheimer and the frontotemporal and the Lewy body disease, because we cannot see amyloid or tau, but we can frankly see much, much better the disconnections compared to any other method of diagnosis. Entropy is another method which actually measures the complexity or variability of the brain activity and is useful for diagnosis some neurological disorders. And there are different methods for analyze the entropy, but the concept is that the more complex is the signal, the more lively is the neuronal activity. The less complex is the signal, the less lively is the neuronal activity. Two extremes are a completely healthy and working brain and a comatose patient in which the entropy is extremely low. So the loss of complexity can indicate a loss of cortical function, leading to a reduction of information processing. Patients, for example, with Alzheimer's disease show lower entropy values compared to entry controls, and the patient with Alzheimer's disease show higher entropy only for the low frequencies. This is not a simple concept, but just to be as simple as possible, entropy and connectivity in higher frequencies is good. Entropy and connectivity in lower frequencies, particularly in delta frequency, is bad, because they means disconnection. So they means that those parts of the brain producing this kind of organization have lost a lot of networks and have lost a lot of neurons. Artificial intelligence, it is probably something that we are speaking too much in recent days. There is no TV talk, there is no meeting in which there is not a section devoted to artificial intelligence. I did not myself yet fully understand what artificial intelligence means, and I did not really catch up which can be the real and useful information that a medical doctor and a physician can take from artificial intelligence approach. I understood that when you have a large amount of data, so-called big data, you can extract a number of features that you have to define yourself in advance, more or less. So still there is a constraint which is operator linked, and you have to define to be sure those features that are really significant for the disease in order to avoid to have very, very surprising replies by the artificial intelligence in the different forms of machine learning, deep learning, and so on. Certainly applied to the EEG in combination with many other information coming from biological biomarkers, the clinical history, which means for one patient you may have many, many hundreds of features to combine, can be important to select the good ones and to extract information in a very short time, and this artificial intelligence can do. In our experience, for example, by simply providing the EEG and making an artificial intelligence approach to the different frequencies and the different EEG analysis, it came out that the algorithm, after some work, was able to identify early stages of the disease in nearly everybody. 97% is an accuracy that is clinically quite valuable. And consider that the simple EEG, a clinical EEG, 32 electrodes, and nothing more, 19 channel recordings, can be done in half an hour and cost a few tens of euros in Europe, which is not a secondary problem when you multiply the cost of a single exam for millions of cases in Europe. In Europe, at this moment, we have about 10 million of MCI subjects, which are a preclinical condition, and several millions. Only in Italy, we have more than 1 million of demented patients. And we enter the last paragraph of my presentation, in which I show the importance of modern types of approach to the EEG analysis. For example, predicting the conversion of the MCI to Alzheimer. Who are the MCI? The MCI of my cognitive impairment are people like me, so apparently totally performing in their profession, in their daily activity, who only fail to one or two tests, neuropsychological tests, but at a level that does not implicate any loss of autonomy in their everyday life, including high-level mental and professional activity. The problem with them is that epidemiologically, it is known that about 40 to 50% of such people, if followed up for 3 years, will become demented, fully demented, while the remainings will never become demented. So one of the main important problems for health authorities at present moment is to have an instrument able to identify as soon as possible the 50% who are at very high risk of being already in a prodromal stage of dementia from the others. Why? Because we can concentrate all the drugs, even if they are relatively poor right now, the future drugs, but all the interventions on lifestyle that are useful and on modifiable risk factors that are also useful, only on those having very high risk. The problem is that we do not have yet such an instrument. There is a fight between different biomarkers producers. Each biomarker has pros and cons. The CSF is invasive, relatively expensive. The PET scan is quite expensive. The MRI is not so sensitive because the structure of the brain is changing late in the disease course. There are a number of studies on blood predictors which are not yet clinically validated, and the EEG is proposing itself as a possible biomarker, not for diagnosis, but for prognosis. And as you see, for example, just looking at one of the connectivity parameters, which is the small word, it is clear that if we compare the Alzheimer's disease subjects with those that are in the MCI condition, we have a situation we have a situation like this. Let's say 74 MCI who are stable during follow-up, 71 for MCI who are converting to dementia during follow-up. We recorded EEG at time 0, so they are clinically identical, no difference clinically between these two groups, but the small world organization is already different, and is different in a way that it is not yet sufficiently sensitive for a complete screening of the population, because we are around close to 70% with the best approach. But they become quite interesting if we combine another biomarker, which is a genetic testing, which is cost about 50 euros, and is the ApoE analysis of the alleles. Putting together the analysis of small world of EEG with the analysis of the ApoE, we go up to 97% of accuracy. The total cost is around 100 euros. Nothing to compare with a PET scan or to a CSF analysis and so on. So I think that we can compete. This is another kind of application in stroke patients, showing that by using artificial intelligence approach, we can, just by looking at the EEG, distinguish with 99% of accuracy healthy signals from stroke signals, the right versus left stroke condition, and most important, the outcome in recovery after 3 months. You know that 2 months is the time window during which more than 90% of recovery is taken in stroke patients. After that, very, very little is gained, if nothing. Brain-computer interface is something that is also part of our media approach, because it is impacting a lot on the general opinion. Reading the brain activity and predicting the performance in the healthy, but more important for a physician, reading the brain activity and using this kind of information in those patients who are tetraplegic or completely paralyzed, including the face muscles, and therefore cannot communicate with the external world in any way. So by doing so, and by, for example, driving external computers or external devices, one can reconnect in some way a patient brain with external world, helping a lot, possibly in everyday life. In this line, you probably heard the breaking news coming from the Neuralinks Prime study by Elon Musk. I was a little bit astonished by the interest that was raised because of the lack of many information. We didn't know really anything about the methodology. There was only a brochure inviting people to participate. No information on the initiation of trial, and the study is not registered in clinicaltrials.gov, which is an open window and an ethical obliged window to check and to control what is going on in the experiments in humans. But this is a kind of approach with minimally invasive type of devices able to record from the brain cortex and hopefully to transfer commands and ideas to external devices. So neuroimaging since early 70s is more used for neurological diagnosis, but little attention has been given to pathologies which first attack the cortical synapses. And I think that within this field, EEG must be able to say much more than it has been said until today. A number of scientific papers are coming with innovative signal analysis method. Unfortunately, from a clinician, most of them, if not all of them, have a little clinical validation. Why? Because they are depending on single lab methods. There are no multicentric studies with large populations, samples, and little harmonization of methodologies. So if we want the DEG survive as a clinical method, we should be able also to produce this kind of papers. And one part of the reason of that is because we have little or no industrial interest on all of this. Quite differently from a PET scan, from MRI, from all the other technologies in which the industrial interest to the research innovation is enormous, and the translation from the bench, from the laboratory bench to the application in patient is quite fast and validated. I think that my time is over. This is my group of collaborators, and I thank them and you for your attention. I hopefully made not a loss of time a presentation for all of you.